In the great kingdom of Uzo, Prince Emeka was known for his pride. He wore the finest clothes, rode the strongest horses, and dined on the richest foods. The people of Uzo bowed before him, not only because he was their future king, but because they feared his arrogance. He never bothered to acknowledge the common folk, for he believed that greatness was measured by wealth and power. One hot afternoon, as Emeka strolled through the bustling marketplace, his expensive sandals barely touching the dusty ground, his eyes landed on a poor young man weaving baskets in a corner. The man's hands were rough, his clothes were simple, and yet he worked with a quiet focus. His name was Obieze. Emeka smirked as he walked up to the weaver, watching him bend reeds into shape. He picked up one of the baskets and inspected it as though it was something beneath him. "Why waste your life weaving these useless things?" Emeka scoffed, tossing the basket aside as if it were trash. "What good can come from a life like yours?" Obieze wiped sweat from his brow and met the prince's gaze with calmness. "A man's worth is not in riches, my prince," he said. "Even a small basket can carry great things." Emeka let out a loud laugh, his voice echoing through the market. "You are just a basket weaver. What do you know of greatness?" He shook his head and walked away, his laughter lingering in the air, leaving Obieze to his work. That evening, as the palace torches flickered in the cool breeze, King Uzo called for his son. Emeka entered the royal chamber, still carrying the smugness of the afternoon. "I hear you mocked a hard-working man today," the king said, his voice calm but firm. Emeka shrugged. "He is just a basket weaver, father. Why should I respect him?" The king sighed and leaned forward. "Pride is a dangerous thing, my son. A wise ruler does not look down on his people. He sees their value, no matter their station." Emeka smirked. "I will rule with power, not with baskets, father." The king only shook his head. "One day, my son, life will teach you that wisdom is worth more than gold." One fateful day, while hunting deep in the forest with his royal guards, Emeka found himself in unfamiliar territory. Before they got to the unfamiliar territory, his guards warned him that they were leaving their safe territory and approaching an unfamiliar one. But he ignored their warnings as always and commanded they continue. The thick trees loomed overhead, casting eerie shadows. Suddenly, a band of outlaws leaped from the bushes, their faces masked, their weapons drawn. The guards fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. Emeka, who had never known true danger, was dragged from his horse and thrown to the ground. The outlaws bound his hands and sneered at him. "Your father will pay a high price for you," their leader spat. "Until then, you belong to us." They took him to a dark, damp cave and left him there, chained like an animal. Emeka sat in silence, his fine clothes now covered in dirt. He had never felt so powerless. His riches, his title, his arrogance, none of it could save him now. News of Emeka's capture spread quickly through the kingdom. The king sent warriors to search the forest, but the outlaws were clever. Days passed, and no one could find the prince's whereabouts. One evening, as the villagers gathered to whisper in fear, Obieze listened closely. He knew the forest well, better than most. He knew its caves, its hiding places, its dangers. He stepped forward and approached the palace gates. "I can find the prince," he declared. The guards laughed. "A basket weaver. What can you do that the king's warriors cannot?" But when the king heard of Obieze's offer, he called him forth. "You are just a simple weaver. What makes you think you can succeed where my best men have failed? Obieze bowed respectfully. I know the paths of the forest, Your Majesty. Let me try. I have nothing to lose. The king hesitated, but seeing no other option, agreed. Go then, and bring back my son. With only his wits and his knowledge of the land, Obieze set off into the night, determined to find the prince who had once mocked him. Under the cover of darkness, Obieze moved through the dense forest, his heart pounding with both fear and determination. He had spent his entire life navigating these woods, and now his knowledge will be put to the ultimate test. The outlaws' hideout was deep in a valley, hidden among large boulders and towering trees. Obieze crouched low behind a thick bush, watching their movements carefully. The guards were tough-looking men with swords at their sides, speaking in hushed voices while keeping watch. He knew that any misstep could cost him his life, but he was willing to take the risk. As the night stretched on, Obieze reached into his pack and pulled out long, sturdy palm fronds. His hands worked swiftly, weaving together a large basket, carefully making it strong yet flexible. He crafted it with a hidden opening at the base, large enough to hide a man inside. His fingers were steady, despite the tension building in his chest. Every second counted. The stars overhead provided little light, but he worked with practiced skill, making sure the basket looked ordinary while being the perfect escape tool. That night, Obieze worked harder than ever. Finally, he wove a special basket, strong and wide. But it wasn't for carrying food, it was for carrying a prince. As the night stretched on, Obieze executed the plans. He gathered dried leaves, twigs, and a small bag of crushed pepper he had brought from the village. Moving carefully, he crept toward the guard's small fire pit, waiting for the perfect moment. With a swift motion, he threw the crushed pepper into the fire. Instantly, thick smoke filled the air, burning the guards' eyes and throats. They coughed and stumbled, momentarily blinded by the stinging sensation. Obieze took his chance. He dashed into the cave, finding Emeka tied to a wooden post. Prince, we must leave. Now, get in, he whispered, cutting the ropes quickly. Emeka, weak but alert, nodded. With no choice, Emeka climbed into the giant basket. Obieze covered it with palm leaves and lifted it onto his back. The bandits didn't even notice what happened. He moved swiftly, avoiding the guards, who were still struggling to regain their sight. By the time the outlaws realized what had happened, the prince and the basket weaver had vanished into the shadows of the night. The journey back to the palace was long and exhausting. Obieze carried the prince for hours. His back ached, but he never stopped. Emeka, while in the basket, had never felt so vulnerable before. He, a prince, had been helpless in captivity, but it was a humble basket weaver who had saved him. Every step closer to home was a reminder of the lesson he had learned. Strength was not about wealth or titles. It was about courage, intelligence, and heart. When they reached the palace gates at sunrise, the guards were stunned. Obieze let down the basket, and the prince came out of it. The prince has returned, one of them shouted. Within moments, King Uzo appeared, his royal robes flowing behind him. When he saw his son, relief washed over his face, and he rushed forward, embracing Emeka tightly. "My son, you are safe!" the king exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. His eyes then turned to Obieze, the young man standing beside the prince, looking weary but determined. "You saved my son's life," the king said solemnly. "How can I ever repay you?" Obieze bowed slightly. "I asked for nothing, Your Majesty," he replied humbly. "I only did what was right." Emeka looked at the man he had once mocked, shame creeping into his chest. He had spent his life believing he was superior to others. But standing here, he realized that his arrogance had blinded him. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You are stronger and wiser than I ever knew. True strength is not in riches, but in kindness and wisdom." For the first time in his life, Emeka bowed his head, not out of weakness, but out of deep respect. The gathered villagers, witnessing this moment, murmured in astonishment. A prince bowing to a basket weaver? It was unheard of. But to Emeka, it was the only thing that felt right. Emeka was no longer the same arrogant prince who had mocked the common people. He had been humbled, and he intended to change his ways. The following morning, he walked through the marketplace, not with his usual air of superiority, but with a newfound respect for the people. He stopped to watch the weavers work, marveling at their skill. He spoke to the farmers, learning about their struggles. He listened to the traders, understanding their hardships. For the first time, the villagers did not bow in fear when he approached. Instead, they smiled and spoke freely, and Emeka felt something he had never experienced before: true connection. The people he once ignored were now the people he admired the most. Years later, when Emeka became king, he ruled with wisdom and humility. He did not forget the lesson Obieze had taught him. He made sure that every craftsman, every farmer, every merchant was treated with dignity and respect. His kingdom flourished not because of his wealth, but because of his people's trust in him. One day, Emeka visited Obieze at his weaving store. "I owe my life to you," he said sincerely. "But more than that, I owe you my wisdom." Obieze smiled, his hands still working on a new basket. "A man's worth is not in what he has," he said, echoing his words from long ago. "It is in how he treats others." And with that, the once proud prince and the humble basket weaver sat side by side, not as a ruler and a subject, but as equals. Moral of the story: never look down on others, for the one you mock today may be the one to save you tomorrow. If you love this story, hit the subscribe button for more African folk tales. The end.